Father Edward McCarthy.
My father was from Sligo and his mother from Dublin. But they came here as the family ended in northern New York, principally because of the type of work that they did. My mother's father had gone from Belfast to Manchester, England after their marriage and lived there some years, and I had older aunts and uncles born there. But he was a horseshoe manufacturer at a time before it was a large industry, and decided he would do better in America than in England. So after he had been married for some years and had about 5 children, he emigrated to the United States. Because there was a factory which is still there, not being used anymore, which was one of the largest horseshoe factories in the United States, and he was employed there for the rest of his life. My father's father ended up not far from Troy, called Hoosick Falls, New York, where he bought a small farm, and my father was up country on this small farm, but working with his older brothers and his father working in town. I was born in Troy, the oldest of 5 children and the only boy, in 1912. When I was about 9 years old, the family moved to Mechanicville, which is a small town just north of Troy, on the Hudson River, and it was there that I grew up and went through most of grammar school and to the public high school there. After I got into high school, I decided, very largely through the influence of a priest in the parish who had become a close friend of my father's and mother's, and who to me was a great example of somebody doing a tremendous amount of good in the world. His name was Christopher McGrath. He was a native of Chicago, and later was a member of our Chicago province when that became an independent province of Augustinians. And I think that, speaking humanly about a vocation, that he was the main source or the main thing that attracted me to the life of a priest and the life of apparently service to people. So I left Mechanicville High School and went to the Augustinian Preparatory Seminary in Staten Island, New York. I graduated from there in 1929 and went to our novitiate, which was then at New Hamburg, New York, near Poughkeepsie, for 1 year. Then we went to Villanova at that time and did our undergraduate work there. So I was at Villanova as an undergraduate student from 1930 to 34, and then went on to theology in Washington. We had a house of theology, as many religious orders did at that time, surrounding Catholic University. And we took theology in our own houses, but took courses in summer school, for example, and part-time during the year at the university. So during the next 4 years, I finished theology, was ordained in 1937, and in 38 received a master's degree in history from Catholic University, and they decided I should continue on, stay there and get a PhD in history, which I did. I finished my coursework and was sent to Villanova to teach in 1940, which delayed my getting the PhD a bit because it gave distractions from such a thing as writing a thesis and so forth. But I finally finished the thesis and oral and written exams and received a PhD degree in 1943. I have been a priest now for 52 years, and I spent a total of almost 3 years in a parish, and in 2 different parishes. And I spent about 9 months as a high school teacher on one occasion, and the rest of my life has been in higher education. I taught first of all at Villanova for 6 years, from 1940 to 46, most of which was a very difficult accelerated program due to World War II. We were teaching in what was called a V-12 program of Navy and Marines, students who were coming out of high school and being prepared for officer candidate school. And it was 3 full semesters of school a year with 1 week off in between. And we did that for 4 full years. It made a rather full program. It was also a difficult time because of emotional things. You got to know these young men. We had up to about 600 of them at one time. And you would have a young man in class, and then 6 weeks later you'd find out he was dead. He had been shot in Germany or in the Pacific or somewhere. Altogether, we lost, at Villanova, which was a small school in those days, we lost 57 men because of military action during World War II. At the conclusion of that program, and in 1946, our province decided to open a university in Havana. This was a very delicate and difficult project because the law in Cuba at the time allowed only for 1 national university. There was pressure from various provinces, particularly Oriente, which is a considerable distance from Havana, about 600 miles, to have a state university there. But this was resisted by the group who tended to control the University of Havana. They didn't want competition. But through the intervention of the United States ambassador at the time, whose name was Mr. Butler from Minnesota, he was able to get a change in the Cuban law which would allow the graduates of a private university to be recognized and to join what they call the colegios of a particular profession. The colegio was, for example, of lawyers, a colegio of architects, a colegio of dentists, and so forth. And you got into that colegio either by graduating from the state university or by examination. So that the law was modified so that the graduates of a private university could become a member of those colegios and therefore could practice a given profession. There were other people interested at the same time in universities, and there was instituted a so-called Universidad Masónica by the Masonic order. It also brought about the creation of a state university in Oriente, which had been advocated for a long time, so that it did bring about a development of educational facilities and possibilities for Cuban students. The University of Havana had one peculiar rule, which we would look upon at least as peculiar. To be a cathedraticum, which would be about the equivalent of our full professor, you had to be an alumnus of the university. And between 1929 and 1933, under the dictatorship of Machado, the university had been closed. So the people getting out of high school in those years either had to leave Cuba or not go to a university. That's all. There was no university there. So many people who could afford to came to the United States. Some went to Europe, some to England, some to France, some to Spain, and attended universities there. This had one good effect, that it brought into Cuban university life and Cuban professions people with somewhat different formation, rather than everybody going right through the same group of classes with the same professors year after year in the one university. However, there developed a group of people who were very competent teachers and who liked to teach. But because they were an alumnus of some other university, in the University of Havana, were not eligible to ever become full professors there. They could be like an adjunct professor or something of that nature. So that when we went to start a university, it was very easy to get a very first-rate faculty. We weren't in competition with anybody. There were a group of people for every subject or area we wanted, such as business, accounting, arts and philosophy, law, that were very willing to teach, very able to teach. But there were graduates we had graduates there from Harvard, from MIT, from RPI, from the University of Illinois, from Tulane, from Stetson, people who were not able to go to the university because of the age group that they were in. So that we got classes started there in the fall of 1946. I was sent there as sort of an academic dean. The title they finally gave me was Regent of Studies, which would be about the equivalent of an academic vice president here. And the school, according to the European model which we were following, and which the University of Havana followed, was set up into schools. Each faculty was called a school, and we had ultimately about 10 schools. To unify the process of those schools, which tended to be very distinct at the National University, we had an academic council of which I was automatically the chairman as the Regent of Studies. And the other 20 members were the dean of each school and one elected faculty member. And we tried as a committee to see that standards were somewhat the same from one school to another, so that you wouldn't be dropping people from one school into another because one was difficult and one was easy or something of that nature. Also, we introduced some American ideas, not without difficulty. And that is that in the National University, your entire grade depended upon a final examination at the end of the year, not at the end of a semester. So that you could either miss a lot of classes or you could go to a lot of classes, and if somehow through cramming or special courses you got the material together for a final exam, you could get a good grade even though maybe you hadn't gone to class. But we insisted on such things of the faculty, with some faculty resistance and a lot of student resistance, of such things as term papers and reports and periodic quizzes and so forth. But it worked. And the result of that was that it soon became known that if you went to Villanueva, you worked. It was not a country club school. And you also learned something. And once we began turning graduates out, it got even better, because as one lawyer who was ultimately our dean of the law school there, and then after he went into exile, became a librarian here when we started St. Thomas, a man named Rodriguez Alvarez, said to me, "Father, this is something new in Cuba. We never expected lawyers to study in law school. They just got a degree. And then they learned law in the bufete or in the law office afterward." But he said, "We're insisting that they know law before they get out of here." And the law offices like that, because they're getting somebody who knows something rather than someone they have to train from scratch. The same thing was true in accounting. We had a very excellent dean of accounting named Eduardo Moreno, who had been educated at Stetson. And he had and got together a good faculty. Raoul Shelton is one of them, whom you would know here. And again, insisted on work. It wasn't just you come and take a final exam, but you work all the way through the year. And the result was, in a short time, when we were graduating accountants and they were getting jobs in auditing firms or other things, the reputation became very rapid that these people are well prepared and that the people are high. A great help in that regard, too, was Pedro Diaz-Maestri, who was the auditor of the university down there, but also taught accounting, and who came here when he had to leave Cuba. On the faculty here for many years. Another person who was a very outstanding person at Villanueva was Mercedes Garcia Tururi and her sister Rosaura. there were three of them there, but the outstanding one was Mercedes. She had been a strong figure in public education in Cuba back as far as the Machado days. And she was very strong when we got into difficulties with the change of government after Batista fell. The university started in 1946, and we closed in 1961, or I'd say were closed would be more accurately stating it, at the day that the so-called Bay of Pigs invasion took place. By that time, the peak enrollment we had was just before the Batista-Castro fighting began, and it was about 1,500 students there. And we had a really good university. And I've always felt that had we had 10 more years, we would have had a very first-rate university. For various factors which I mentioned. One, we had very good financial support from outside because there were a lot of people there who wanted a Catholic university and a good Catholic university. They felt that we were providing that and they were willing to support it. We had this faculty which was easy to select as a very good faculty because of the rule that the other university had that you had to be an alumnus of it to be a full professor there. And these people were, by and large, very dedicated. As in any faculty, here and there we had a weakness, as you would. But I'd say it was a strong faculty, and as a result, it was a strong school, and we did very well there. I think there has been a rather major misconception over the years here, whether it's deliberate or indeliberate, I don't know, that this school is a successor of that. It is not. There's no connection at all. It's just an accident.
St. Thomas.
St. Thomas or Biscayne, yeah. What happened was here that in 1957, this was created as a diocese, dividing the then one diocese in the state of St. Augustine. And Bishop Coleman Carroll was made the first Bishop of Miami. There was a college here that had then been operating about 17 years, Barry College for Girls. And he was very anxious to have a counterpart of that for men. And what he wanted really was just a liberal arts college. He sort of consented to having other things put in, such as business and so forth, but he was interested in, as many people are who have that type of education, a philosophical and religious-oriented and humanistic education. So he had tried to get several orders of people, priests, to accept this job of putting a college here. He started first with the Holy Ghost Fathers, as they go, who run Duquesne University, because he was a graduate of that. He was an alumnus of Duquesne. And they just didn't have the manpower. Then he tried to get Holy Cross priests from Notre Dame. They didn't turn him down completely, but they were debating it and they weren't at all sure they could handle it because of other commitments they had in 3 or 4 other colleges. The result was he didn't have anybody, and just about that time we were expelled from Cuba, which meant about 18 Augustinian priests came out of Cuba. And that was the time that he approached our provincial to see if the Augustinians could take a college here. And had we remained in Cuba, we would probably have been the same as the other 2 orders. We wouldn't have been able to. But since he had this release of manpower, our provincial council decided that we would accept this invitation. So I was unemployed all the way from the Miami airport to a taxi. Because we came out of Cuba one day and the provincial came down to meet us at the airport here and had made reservations at a hotel downtown, I think the Columbus. And driving downtown in a taxi, he said to me, "Ed, the bishop wants us to start a college here and we're going to accept it and you're the president." That was the search committee. So that's how I became the first president of Biscayne. So I went home because I hadn't been there in a while, and my mother had died earlier that year, and spent some time with my sisters up in Troy, and then came down here at the end of July of 1961. What I saw here was a town dump, very literally. There were no buildings of any kind, of any shape on here. There was one bulldozer down at the south end of the property, digging a hole for what became Pace High School. The school for retarded children on the other side of the property came several years later. On the grounds here were old bathtubs and stoves and junk that people drove by in cars and just dumped here. That's all was the thing. So that meant a cleanup job. And the bishop was a fellow I got along with well. Everybody didn't, but I always did, because he was a very honest fellow and a man getting things done. He was here to start a diocese. He didn't have a lot to work with. And he had to bring in more priests, and he had to start parish school and this and that. So he always thought you could have it finished yesterday, why? So he said to me at the end of July, well, I want this school to open in September. I said, well, we could possibly open it in September 1964. This was July of 1961. He said, you can open it this September. I said, there's no way. We have no students. We have no faculty. We have no charter. We have no buildings. And how do you get all those in a matter of 5 weeks? Well, take one more year. So we had to agree with that we would open in September of '62. So then I started to move on that. And I got in touch through the Chancery, because he was also at the time the attorney for the Archdiocese, for the then diocese, Clyde Atkins, whom I was today. And Clyde got the charter for us, the original charter, through Tallahassee. And then we decided what we would teach in 1962, which were only freshman courses. So we needed, somebody for history, which I took, and in the meantime, Father Sullivan had been sent down here to be the prior of the religious community and to be an academic dean, and his field was English. And then we had from Cuba, Father Bush, who was a Dutch priest now teaching chemistry at Villanova, and he came here and spent 10 years here. So that we got a nucleus of a faculty together to start classes for freshmen in September of 1962. But by that time, we had hired an architect. He had designed the building, which is now Kennedy Hall, and it was 3/4 built, I would say, by September of '62. So we couldn't start classes there. But Barry came to our rescue. If it were not for Barry, Biscayne would not have lasted more than 1 year, or maybe 2. And that has always made me feel bad about relations between the two later on, which I don't think were what they should be. That I don't want to say too much about it now, but that has bothered me over the years, that if it weren't for Barry, we'd be dead. And we didn't show, I think, the gratitude or cooperation that deserved. They gave us classroom space. They gave us faculty. For example, we had some people wanted to go into science, and they needed a more advanced math course. We had no one to teach it. They had a nun with a PhD in math. She took these 2 or 3 young boys we had and gave them this advanced math that they needed, and with no recompense of any kind for that. Finally, of course, we got the building finished, and we started on a dormitory and a dining hall, so that in the following year, '63, we could take in some resident students. And that worked all right, but again, we didn't have the dormitory finished. And we had which unfortunately, in those days, probably more than now, there was a more distinct off-season and on-season. And we were able to rent a whole motel at a pretty reasonable rate for a period of a couple months until this dormitory would be finished. And one of the priests went over and lived there as sort of a prefect. So then we had 2 years going. The second year we had the freshmen, the sophomores, and the thing then went along, and in 1966 we had our first graduating class. We came up for accrediting in 1967 and were turned down by the Southern Association because of our financial condition. They thought the faculty we had assembled was adequate, that the courses were adequate, and other things, that the library even was adequate, which of course wasn't very extensive at that time. But our financial management and our financial security and so forth was not to their liking. Of course it wasn't to mine either, but I was hoping very much to get that accrediting as a means of advancing the school. So that set us back for a year. And in the following year, accrediting was obtained, so it was just a matter of a 1 year delay. But it probably didn't help, because it's always bad to be turned down on something like that and then have to go after it again. I left here in 1968. I was transferred by the provincial from here to Merrimack College. And I was up there for 3 years as the prior of the community and teaching history. In the second year I was there, I ended up as the chairman of the history department. That was not because of my sterling qualities, but because of the lack of interest of a couple other profs of being the chair. They figured they could let somebody else do that. So I spent 2 years there as chairman of the history department. And then in 1971, I was transferred again to Villanova as president of the university there. That was a bad time to be a college president. In 1970 was when that Kent State affair took place, at which several students were killed. There was a great period of great disillusionment, I think, on the part of college people in regard to the Vietnam War and our government officials and a lot of other things. And about many things they were right, but they didn't know what to do about it, so what they did was demonstrate or throw rocks at the president's office or some such thing. At Villanova, I'd say we were luckier than some places. On a couple occasions, I had demonstrations outside my office. The president's office there is at the end of a long corridor. And I would have a double line of people sitting down the wall on both sides, and you have to walk down by it. But they were never too angry, and I used to walk down and joke with them and say hello and good morning, and the thing went along all right. We did have a group who always tried to protest when we had moved from the V12 to an NROTC program, which we still have at Villanova. And when they would drill or something, there would be people out there heckling them and this sort of thing, warmongers and this sort of thing. So, in general, it was rather rough, but we got through it, I think, better than some other schools. We did have one bad incident in which we had to have some expulsions and lengthy suspensions because of physical violence with the local police. I didn't think that was something that could be tolerated. So that it was a tough time. Since then, I did spend about 9 months as a pastor in Darien. And then went back to Villanova and taught for a semester, and then went to the Bronx, where we have a parish where they could use someone who spoke Spanish. So I spent 2.5 years in the Bronx, principally for that reason. I could say Mass, hear confessions, preach, and so forth in Spanish, and talk to people in the office in Spanish. Then went back from the Bronx to Merrimack, and I was made for a brief time the academic vice president, and then had a heart attack. in 1981, so I was brought back to Villanova. And I suppose I've been in some sort of retirement since that time. But I was a member of the Board of Trustees of Villanova and then was elected the chairman of it. I'm a consultant to a board in Washington. I'm on the board here and on the board at Malvern Prep. And I'm on an international economic committee that our general has, and I have to go to Rome every couple of years or so on that. So it's been kind of an active retirement, I would say. I think I retired, but nobody was told about it. So here I am, that's about it.
About a half an hour, you've gone through your entire life. I wonder if we could go back and put some footnotes into some of those areas and expand on some of them. What about your youth? You went to public schools, is
Right.
that true?
Yeah, I grew up in a small town north of Troy.
Yeah.
And at the time I was there was no parochial school. Everybody went to public school, that's all there was.
Uh-huh.
And actually, I've never regretted it because I had very dedicated teachers. For a small town and a small high school, I think we got a very good education from very dedicated people.
What do you recall from what are your earliest memories of your youth living with your sisters and your parents? What was your house like?
It's hard to say. It was a regular house. We had not an elaborate one. Living room, dining room, kitchen,
Two
three
stories?
bedrooms. No, one story.
Uh-huh.
And just a normal house.
What were the neighbors like? Was it an Irish Catholic area?
Yes, the town of Mechanical I grew up in was about 7,500 population at that time. About 5,000 Catholics. There were 2 Catholic parishes in the town, one Italian and one everything else, referred to as the Irish parish, but the Irish parish had a considerable number of Lithuanians, Poles, Germans, etc. There were 4 Protestant churches in town, rather established sects, Presbyterian, Methodist, Baptist, Episcopalian, but with smaller congregations because there weren't that many people around, so it was a very Catholic atmosphere. In the schools I went to, for example, the vast majority of teachers were Catholic. And in the small businesses you have in a town like that, the drugstores and grocery stores and clothing stores and things, most of them were run by Catholic people. It was a very Catholic, almost like an ethnic neighborhood might be in a big city, if you could drop that into Detroit or Chicago or something.
And the chief occupation of the people?
Well, there were 2 main things, the railroads and the paper mill. The West Virginia Paper Company had a very large mill in Mechanicsville that employed, when I was young, about 1,200 men. My father worked there. Then there were 2 railroads that had freight depots there and roundhouses, as they were called, where locomotives were repaired and so forth. That was the Western Freight Terminal for the Boston and Maine and a junction terminal for the Delaware and Hudson, which was mainly a anthracite coal-carrying railroad from the East India area to Montreal, Canada. And they were the main 2 industries people worked either there. In the meantime, now the paper mill has disappeared because it became antiquated, and in area it cost more than putting up a new one. So the West Virginia moved out of there and put up a very large plant in Kentucky. The people now living there either work in Schenectady, which has the headquarters of General Electric, or in Albany. A lot of them are state workers, work somewhere in the state government in Albany.
What did your dad do in the paper mill?
Painting and maintenance of a sort. I mean, they was called a painting crew. But they also did some what we call repair work or maintenance work preparing for painting. If something had to be done before, they didn't bring someone else in to do it and then they painted. They had to do the maintenance and the painting. It was manual labor. It was collar work.
How much education had he had?
Grammar school. He had finished grammar school.
In the
Then he went to high school.
He was born in the U.S.?
Yes.
In
He was born in Music Falls, New York.
What position did you have when he died? In other words, did he get a chance to see you become a college president, or at what point?
No, he died in 1944.
44.
I was a teacher at Villanova at the time. I was teaching history at Villanova.
And a priest.
And a priest. I had been a priest about 7 years.
Because your life reflects the American dream in a way, doesn't it?
Yes.
The success you've had, those origins.
Yes, I would say that.
Yeah. And your mother was a housewife?
Yes. She had worked in a shirt factory before she married, because that's what young women in Troy did. Troy at that time made about 90% of the shirts and collars when men wore detached stiff collars. About 90% of them were made in Troy, particularly by Arrow Shirt, which is Clewitt Peabody. And that's practically where all young women worked. My aunts worked there and my mother worked there, and that's where. And then she, from the time she married, she didn't work.
Your sisters, you were the oldest.
Yeah.
So
I had 4 sisters, one a year younger than I am. She died 2 years ago. And then I have 2 living sisters. Both are widows now. One is about 73 and the other 70. And the youngest sister died this past year. She was 62 when she died.
did any of them become professional women?
No, one became a nurse and a medical record librarian. She was the oldest. She was the one who became a nurse, and then later on she went to St. John's University in Brooklyn and took library science and so forth for this medical record work.
So can you recall
The others were secretaries.
What was it like back then? You say you were born in 1912, when you were a boy in the home, when you came home from school. Do you recall what you did around the house without television? And
Well,
did you have radio then?
We didn't do anything about television,
No.
nor did we have radio. And one of the things I remember, that there was a family about the size of our own, but a little older. The oldest in the family was probably about 4 years older than I am, and then there was one brother that was my age and another one younger, and so. But named Sullivan, and Jim Sullivan, who was the oldest, got very interested in radio when it was first coming out, sort of in the early 20s. And I remember being with them and how thrilled we were that with this little whisker on a piece of crystal, we could get Schenectady, all the way from Schenectady, which was 16 miles away. And I remember doing that very vividly. And it's, as you know, from coming from that type of climate yourself, it's a pretty cold climate up there. And it's very hilly. And so one of the things I did a great deal of when I was young was skiing. We did no ice skating, strangely enough. Some people did, but we never did, but we did ski. And that's one thing I can remember my parents getting me whenever I needed them skis. And I never knew I worried them at all until I was a priest and an adult some years, and my mother said to me, "You'll never know how worried I was every time you went out on the slope."
Was a man who worked in a paper mill able to raise 5 kids well? And it's hard to believe, isn't it? Now
He did.
you never sensed any poverty.
Well, besides not having too much money, my father was, and I think my mother was too, both of them were very conservative, financially, I would say. And one of the things we didn't do was go in debt for anything. For example, I think we were the last family in the area where we lived, in a block or so, to have an electric refrigerator instead of the old icebox. That's another thing I remember, is emptying that icebox pan out from on the bottom, you know. Because my father wouldn't buy one on credit or anything. We if you couldn't pay for it, you couldn't afford it. And so we got a refrigerator when he could go and pay for it. And the same way was true of a radio. Until he could pay for a good radio, we didn't have one. That was his philosophy about everything. So that we didn't have a lot, but we never had any problem with clothing or food or essentials, and we lived a happy life. We didn't know we were any poorer than anybody else.
What was the community you were in? Did you have like a little town square where you congregate, or where would you hang out as a teenager, for instance?
Mostly around the schools. The way the town had two main streets that came together in a sort of T, a Main Street and Park Avenue. And right at that T was the Episcopal Church on one side, across the street and down about half a block, the Methodist Church, then a large public grammar school, and then the high school on the other side of the Episcopal Church. And back of the grammar school and high school was sort of a hill that went down to the Hudson River. And they had a playground there for the grammar school children with the usual things that have, swings and slides and that sort of thing. And then an athletic field at the bottom, which was a high school athletic field, but was used by both grammar school, high school, and adults even for recreation, for baseball, football, things of that type.
Did you play any sports when you were a teenager?
Not there, because I just went into high school there and spent 1 year, and then went down to Staten Island.
So you only spent 1 year in high school before you
went into the minor seminary, yeah.
Do you ever recall any ethnic tensions between these various ethnic groups?
Very slight of anti-Italian feeling, because about 1/3 of the town was Italian. And I'd say it's now over 50% Italian, but when I was there it was about 1/3. And it was very slight, and I think the principal reason for that was they had a pastor there for many years who had been ordained a priest back around 1906. And he felt that the way to bring the Italian population up to the level of the others there socially was through education. So he picked out smart children and educated them. For example, when I was a freshman in high school there, we used to have an assembly on Friday afternoon, and they would have somebody give us a talk about something. And I remember them bringing in this young lawyer named Tate, who later became a judge. But he was the first Italo-American boy in mechanical who had become a lawyer. Then several he picked out, and a girl who was in my class became the principal of the high school there later on. And this is the way he brought the group up, and with no friction. I mean, he wouldn't bother anybody, didn't want them to bother anybody. But feeling that if you are on an educational level with others, they can't look down on you very much. And it worked very well.
What was the importance of religion in your life in those early days?
Well, I think that's due to my parents, that it was important. In other words, both of them were what I would call today a very practical Catholics. They would have to have 2 broken legs, I think, to miss Mass on Sunday. You see, and the same thing was true with us. It never occurred to me I'd miss Mass on Sunday. That was just like saying I'd have breakfast. I mean, you just got up and went to Mass. So there was that type of influence there that a great respect for the church in the sense of any official document of anything the bishop said or anything of that nature, you see. And I had it on all of us, the 5 of us, because I think my 4 sisters, none of whom became religious, but they were very good Catholic people.
What do you think the future of the priesthood is, especially in this country?
Well, I think on a long-range point of view, it will be all right. I think on a short-range point of view, we're going through a great scarcity. Because it's true not just in this country. What's going on in this country is going on also in Western and Central Europe. And I think that it's going to take some turning around of the society itself. to bring the notion to young people that the priesthood or religious life for women or anything of this nature is a desirable way to live. I think the secularistic society in which we live has made any commitment, long-term, lifetime commitment to some such thing as a celibate priesthood sound like something only a very foolish person would do. And, instead of pointing out to people that it's a very useful life of service and a very happy life. I feel my life has been a very happy one. It hasn't all been roses. I've had some difficult jobs, but I think I've had a very good life and a very interesting life.
You've had no regrets?
And no regrets at all. No.
Do you think there's a possibility that in the next 50 years they might allow married clergy?
That I don't know anything of that. You're speculating, because I don't know what the church or anybody else is going to do in 50 years, and I don't intend to hang around to find out. But I would doubt it, because we've had celibacy somewhere for about 1,700 years, and we've had it in the Universal Western Church for about 1,000 years, and it has worked. So I don't think you throw that out in a great hurry. It could be thrown out. I mean, there's nothing, all celibacy is a church law. It's not any dogma or doctrine or anything of that nature. I would not like to see that happen, because from what I think is a practical thing, I don't see why you would think that a priest would be better selecting a wife than a layman is. And since about 50% of the marriages that laymen enter into end in a divorce court, I don't know why those of priests would fare better.
What was that like to go away? It seems awfully harsh and cruel to me, and frightening that a boy would go away at the age of what, 14?
13 or 14. But I was, you went home about 4 times a year. So I was home at Christmas, home at Easter, home for 3 months in the summertime. It wasn't any different than going to boarding school, for example, from that point of view.
Do you recall the day you left to go to Staten Island?
Yeah.
Well, how did you get there? By train?
Train from Albany to New York, and then ferry over to Staten Island.
Your family saw you off at the train?
Yeah. And this Father McCarthy, whom I mentioned, went to Staten Island with. See, we don't take people that young now. We don't take them out of high school even. Which some people think is one of the things that's deterring vocations. The theory being that now it's better to take them when they're adults and when they know what they're doing and have a very firm idea. But actually what we are getting, as far as I can observe, are what I would call second vocation people. We're getting people who tried something else and for whatever reason didn't like it too much and then decided to become a priest. For example, we had 2 people take simple vows for the first time, finishing their novitiate last year. I did that when I was 18 years old. These people were 56 and 52. Now, they have to spend 4 more years in theology before they would get ordained. And that would make them 60 and 56. And what service are they going to be to the church as priests if you start at 60? The man who is 56 and will be 60 happens to be named McCarthy. It's just an accident. I don't even know the man. But he does have a PhD in psychology. So he could probably be put in a classroom without. That's what he did. I don't know what he did with his degree before he came to us. We're professing 2 people again this year, 126, which isn't bad. He's a graduate of Merrimack, and the other is 37. So it's another, again, a man who's been in some profession. Certainly he was working at something. He's a certified dietitian. And evidently didn't like it, so he's ended up studying for the priesthood. I have no objection to that at all in theory. Someone trying something and saying, I don't like this so much, so I'll try something else. But I wonder if you're getting first-rate people that way, which is what we need. We don't need quantity, I don't think, as much as quality.
What was the dropout rate in your own, of those who were ordained with you? How many remained?
6, 3 remain. 9 of us were ordained. We didn't lose anybody for the first 35 years. And then we lost 3 in 1 year, 1972.
They left or
They died.
they died?
And we have had 3 more die since that time. And there are 3 of us left.
They all remained priests?
Oh yeah, there were nobody left, a
Yeah.
priest or anything. 6 out of the 9 have died and 3 are alive. 3 of us live in Villanova.
When's the last time you went back to Mechanicsville?
About 2 weeks ago.
Do people still live there, you know?
I have one distant cousin there. She's, I don't know how distant, maybe like about a third cousin or something. And a couple people who are obviously elderly people who are at least as old as I am. And that's all. The rest of the town I wouldn't know at all, nor would they know me.
You would. The
But you
town,
figure, I left there permanently, if you will, when I went to the novitiate. That was 60 years ago. So anybody under 60 wasn't even born then. So,
yeah.
and then towns change. The real estate development told me that when they put up a real estate development, they expect that within 10 years of its occupancy, 50% of the people will have moved. Some will have died, some will have been transferred, some just moved. So I would say in Mechanical now that the number of people who were alive there and I would know 60 years ago would be a mere handful.
And you think the town is a better town to live in now than it was when you were a boy, or?
Yes, because of the closing of the paper mill.
Uh-huh.
See, paper mill, they didn't know much about ecology, or they didn't talk about it much 60 years ago. And you do use a lot of sulfur in the manufacture of paper from pulpwood. And I'm sure that the atmosphere was very bad and people didn't even think about it at the time. And the thing I notice now going up there is the town looks much cleaner. And that's because there's no industrial dirt or anything, which doesn't help economically, but it helps the paint on your house and that sort of thing.
You're an Irishman, but you certainly got involved with a lot of Latins, didn't you? How did your interest in Spanish as a language occur?
That happened when I was in theology. We used to go to Catholic U for summer school. And I went there and took history, and I got to know this Franciscan from the Middle West named Francis Borges Steck. And he taught Latin American history. And he got me interested in it. So I decided when they wanted me to get a degree in history that I would major in Latin America, and I did it under Steck. And that gave me the interest in Spanish. So I had to acquire a reading knowledge of it in order to do the research work and so forth that I had to do there. I only took one course in Spanish in my life, which was called Advanced Conversation and Composition. And that was where I started and stopped. But I had to be able practically to read it, which I acquired that knowledge. Steck helped greatly. I always remember one assignment he gave me. In summer school, I had him for 2 courses, and he gave me a term paper for each. And I scoured the Catholic U library for material and got nothing. So then I went down to town and went to the Library of Congress and got nothing. And came back to him and told him that I can't find anything in English on those 2 subjects in either this library or the Library of Congress. He said, "Oh, of course not. You should have told me. I would have saved you all that time. There isn't anything in English on those 2 subjects." I said, "But I don't read Spanish." And he said, "Oh, you don't? Well, I'll give you an extra week." So he gave me an extra week, and I got the 2 term papers done. I've always felt after that that any student can do any assignment if he's willing to do what's required to do it.
And your PhD was in
history.
In history. What kind of history?
Well, there they said it was in history. No kind, any kind. Everything is a fair question, like in a final exam. But you major in one field, and mine was in Latin America, with a minor in international law and a second minor in English history.
You did a dissertation?
Yeah.
What was it, what was the topic?
The Spanish conquest of the Philippine Islands. I took that because one of the priests who were involved in that were Augustinian priests from Mexico who went out to the Philippines.
And this Spanish background, was that part of the reason you were picked to go to Cuba?
Yes.
That was 46.
1946.
The university had been founded?
That's when it opened. It started in September of 1946.
Who picked the name for the institution?
I guess Father Spirelli, who was the fundraiser who got the money together. He was a pastor there, and I think he did, as far as I know. Maybe it was our provincial, I'm not sure, but I would think it was Father Spirelli.
St. Thomas was a Augustinian bishop in
yes,
Spain.
Right, he's the patron of Villanova here, St. Thomas of Villanova.
Father Spirelli was quite a character, was he?
Very much so. The man was unbelievable in his ability to sell. This university could use him right now, where you need about $19 million to get out of them. Cubans did not have a tradition of giving to the church, as most Latins don't, because of the union of church and state. See, in the Spanish system, the church was supported by the state, as it was in Italy and other places. And as a result, the people tended to figure they did their obligation to the church by paying taxes. So that to go and get money from individuals for some church activity was very difficult. They said, well, the government takes care of that and we pay taxes. Now, when Cuba became independent, they separated church and state the way pretty much on the American model. But the thing is that tradition still held. You see, you don't just change it overnight. So what Spirelli did to those people, and I think for them, was to educate them to the obligation they had. If God had been good to them and gave them some wealth, that they should share this with other people who didn't have as much. And he built several churches, he built this university, he built a clinic that was amazing. It was so well designed and so good for to take care of poor people, and got doctors and specialists to donate their services there so many hours a week. So that this clinic was in a very poor section, as you might imagine. But the people there were getting very first-class medical attention and free. And Spirelli was the one who did that. I couldn't imagine anyone else being able to do it. So he got this idea of the university. He got the land donated by a group of people who owned it. He got large donations from several rich people. There was a man named Agustin Batista, who was not related at all to the dictator, who was a banker, a man named Arango, who was a lawyer and very well-to-do, a lady named Faya, who owned, some people said, the best sugar mill in Cuba. And another family named Lopez de Oña. And he got, and then a lot of others, a little less than that category. The Van Hulls was one family, which was the Gomez Mena family. Gomez Mena was probably the richest man in Cuba. And so he got these people to contribute very substantially to these projects. And he had one thing, he didn't have any idea of a university, you know, what to do. You build a building and there it is.
He was a peasant, wasn't he, himself?
Came from a little farming town in the Abruzzi, in the Apennine Mountains, you know. And came to America when he was about 21 years old. worked in South Philadelphia, went to school at night, and then got himself into Villanova, and then into seminary and priesthood. Was just a fabulous character.
Do any photographs of him exist anywhere?
They should,
Not to see some. I've never.
because he hasn't been done. See, he came to live here in 1962, and he died maybe around 1965 or 66, something like
So he was your fundraiser, and he started the school,
Yeah.
and then you were vice rector at the.
that. The equivalent of that, they're called Regent of Studies.
And the rector was.
A man named Hurley, James Hurley. He just died about a year ago at the age of 90. And he was rector there from 46 when we started to 1950. Then Father Kelly became the rector. And he was rector for about 9 years. And then when the situation, he was rector until Castro came into power. He was able to get a man who was a friend of his, a priest, Cuban priest, and a pastor downtown to take the rectorship of the university. And he later became the auxiliary bishop of Havana, and he's now an auxiliary bishop in Venezuela because he was put out of Cuba. His name is Bosa Masvidal.
What was Havana like in those days?
One of the nicest cities you could imagine.
Oh.
Hmm?
In what way?
Well, a lot of ways. Climate, I think, is about the best climate I've ever lived in. I'd say it's colder than Florida in the summer and warmer in the winter. And the difference between summer and winter is very little. It's rainy season and dry season, but hardly any temperature difference. The people were very likable and very industrious. The impression I had of Cubans are that they are very bright, they work very hard, and they can accomplish anything except governing themselves. That, I guess, is history also, because the Spaniards never allowed them to govern themselves or to have any Cuban in a position of real authority. They could have jobs in the city government, for example, in what they call the alcaldía. But they couldn't be provincial governors or Supreme Court judges or anything that of any elevated authority. And the same thing was true in the church. They did not encourage people into the priesthood. They wanted to send priests from Spain. And they would not have a Cuban made a bishop. They had to come from Spain. And the reason for that was that they would have control if there were any political uprisings or anything. And this is one reason that the generation of what they call down there 1895, that's when the second revolution for independence began, never went to church. When we were there, a lot of those men were still alive. Their grandsons were students at our university, and his grandsons went to church, but the grandfathers didn't, which is sort of the reverse of what you expect normally. But they, to be loyal to the church in the 1890s and early 1900s was to be anti-Cuban, and they're looking at it that way. Now, when I went there, they had their first cardinal. Archbishop Arteaga was made a cardinal. And Archbishop Arteaga's family evidently had migrated from Spain into two directions, one to Venezuela, one to Cuba. So when he wanted to study for the priesthood, he had an uncle who was a priest in the Diocese of Caracas. So he went there to study for the priesthood because he couldn't go into the seminary in Cuba. And he was ordained there about 1903 and did not return to Cuba until about 1912. He had been a priest about 9 years before he came back to Cuba. And then later on he was made the Archbishop of Havana and then a cardinal. But his family had been very active in the movement for independence. And that's why the Spanish authorities wouldn't let him study for the priesthood.
You were there then from 46 to 59?
61. I left there in 61.
The rise of Fidel Castro. At first, the people, in hearing about Fidel, what was their opinion of him?
Well, he was a national hero. I wasn't there all that time. I went there in 46. Then I spent a year in South America, 47 and 48.
Where were you there?
Everywhere except Paraguay. It was a year's sabbatical to study and travel. And
Traveled around?
Yeah.
How did you travel?
By plane mostly, some by train.
Yeah. You weren't backpacking or
No,
roughing it?
Not mules, no, or anything, no.
What was your favorite city in South America, or favorite area?
I think the favorite area would be Chile. Again, that's a question of people and climate. They're very likable people. The most impressive, I think, because of the way it was laid out by a man who didn't know how to read or write, is Lima. He knew how to draw, but he didn't know how to read or write. And so he laid out the broad streets and plazas and boulevards and so forth. That was Francisco Pizarro back in 1541. The best city is Buenos Aires, without a doubt. To me, Buenos Aires was a clean Chicago. I figured if you could scour Chicago for a month, it would look like Buenos Aires. A very well designed and run city. That may have changed since then because of various governmental upheavals they have had. But the city itself was extremely impressive.
Have you traveled in Europe as well? Or?
Somewhat, yes. I've been to Europe 4 or 5 times, I guess.
Do you have a favorite place in the whole world?
No. I've lived in Cuba, I've lived here, I've lived in Villanova, I've lived in Massachusetts, and I've been sort of satisfied in all of them. Permanently, I would not want to live again outside the country. I think when you get old enough, you're content to stay in your own country. When I was younger, that didn't bother me.
When did you begin having suspicions about Fidel Castro?
Well, from the beginning, actually. Because I had the advantage of not being a Cuban. There were very few Cuban families that did not suffer under Batista, either in their immediate family or a relative or a neighbor or somebody had been tortured or put in jail or something. So the turning against Batista was almost 100%. And the one person that seemed right from the beginning being against him and showing some leadership was Fidel Castro. So he did have the sympathy of all the people, I would say. Now there were some people there who knew his background and knew that he was a communist and that he was getting communist aid, that actually aid was coming in through Russian ships into Santiago, down at the other end of the island. So that I used to tell the Cubans around the university, well, you will get rid of Batista, but you may get something worse. And they would say, oh no, Father, you don't understand. Nothing could be worse. That was their attitude. Which is understandable. If you have an extremely bad government, you could figure, well, if we get rid of this, doesn't matter what comes next, it will be better, you know. And that's what they felt. Actually, Batista was not too bad when they didn't bother him. When they started the opposition to him was when he began to get rough. And he did not hurt the economy. He improved the economy of the country. So that there were more jobs, there was more money, and this sort of thing going on. The economy was better. When Castro came in, I said to someone, and I think this was true, if he would just come in and sit on his hands and do nothing, but insist on honesty in the administration of the government, he will be the greatest historical figure in this country, and the country will boom, because one of the things about Cubans is they're very, as I mentioned to you, I think, intelligent, industrious, hardworking people. But they look upon the public treasury as something that you should tap if you have any possibility of so doing. And they used to say there in jest, but with some truth in the jest, that if you became a minister of the government and didn't become a millionaire, that showed you had no interest in the welfare of your family. And there was a man that was being promoted there for the presidency for a while, and he had the reputation of great honesty. And he had had several other governmental positions. So I mentioned to the dean of the law school one day that, why don't you people get behind this man? You know, this is all the country needs is an honest man. Put him in. He said, well, Father, I'm not sure you understand what honest means. And honest means he only had one arm into the treasury up to his elbow, not both arms in up to his shoulder. So that was the relative honesty. And that's why the corruption of government over a 60-year period led to 3 dictators. Castro's the 3rd dictator, not the 1st. Got Machado and then Batista and Castro.
Anyway, things really heated up for you around the time of the Bay of Pigs, I guess, at the,
that was
the university.
That was the climax. They had heated up for a couple of years before that. But that was the day the university was closed and never reopened.
Can you describe that day? Did you hear any bombing or anything? Or
Oh no, we were not that close. That was on the south side of the island. We were on the north side. But very early in the morning, the university was surrounded by militia. And they didn't do anything. They didn't stop anybody from coming in or going out, but they were there, prepared to do something if an order came to do something. So we decided the best thing to do is what few students came, not many students came, but the few did, we sent home. And told the faculty also to go home. Our home was there, so we lived there. And I forget what time now, but it was still daylight, I think, so it was maybe 5, 6 o'clock in the afternoon, something like that. This group came in and told us that we had to remain in our house there and that we were under arrest.
you lived on a house on the campus?
Yes, just like they do here in the Maastricht. Then one of the buildings, our engineering building, had a rather large auditorium. So 3 or 4 hours later, it was probably about 9 o'clock at night, they came over and told us we had to move over to the auditorium. Well, when we got to the auditorium, about 20 other people were there, but they had just picked up outside and brought in. I think they rounded up that day about 250,000 people around the island. So I think it was just one of these big swoops. Go out and get anybody that looks suspicious and bring them in. And there were never any charges brought against us. We were told that we were counter-revolutionaries, which was enough, I guess. The fact that most of us were Americans, we had one Dutchman, Father Bush, and we had several Spaniards, but the majority were American. That, of course, was bad enough to be that. So we remained in that auditorium for about 12 days with people with shotguns, automatic shotguns, or machine guns, submachine guns, following your every motion, like when you move, they move. One day one of the priests said to me, you know, we're very silly to ever worry about dying of a cancer or a heart attack. One of those kids is going to get bored someday, and that'll be the end of all of us. But they didn't abuse us physically. Down the island, some of the priests were beaten and abused and that sort of thing. We were not. We were quizzed by the secret police for several hours, one at a time. That was no problem because they sent out very dumb people to do it, but very unintelligent people. So we talked about what we wanted to talk about, and they let us get away with that.
What's that like living for 12 days in an auditorium? Where did you sleep? On the floor?
Yeah. Just slept on the floor. With your clothes on. You didn't take your clothes off.
At bathroom facilities somewhere?
Yeah, it's down a corridor, about 30 feet. No more than that. Maybe 40 or 50 feet. And if you had to go to the bathroom, you went to the door and told the guard, and he waited till there was another guard ready to put a gun in your back and march you down and wait for you to go to the bathroom and then march you back.
How'd you pass the time?
Walking up and down the aisle, playing chess. I learned how to play chess. I had never done that before. Someone had a chess set. And talking and sitting there and waiting and listening to a radio blared very loudly at you with communist propaganda 24 hours a day. But so you slept through that too.
How real, I would think you would have had very real fears that maybe you would not emerge from that alive.
Not really. There was some fear, but it was not that it would be an intentional thing. It would be like this priest said, one of those kids would get bored.
Yeah.
We felt they did not want to make martyrs. I know that had I stayed there, I think I would have gotten 30 years in prison. Because other people who did what I was doing got 30 years in prison. But I'm pretty sure I would not have been put to death or shot because they didn't want to make martyrs.
You had ample warning. That was the worst kept secret in the world, that there was going to be an invasion. The papers were reporting a build-up here in Opelika.
Yeah.
Did you consider leaving before the invasion? What did you think would happen to Americans after an invasion?
Well, what we didn't know or couldn't find out was when. So you couldn't make a plan to leave before, so you didn't know what before what. You might come 2 years after that. It was, as you say, the worst kept secret. I figured there was no reason why I'd have a primary interest in that. But there certainly was that Fidel Castro should have an interest in it. And I knew all about it except when. And if I knew that without trying to find out, what did Castro know about it? Who had a great reason to know. And we always felt over there that there were 100 people here working on the other side. President Kennedy had been elected when that happened, but had not taken office yet. When he did, he assumed responsibility for it, because that went with the job he had. But in the first year he was in office, 3 top people of the CIA were dismissed.
Who were working on the Cuban?
Yeah. For example, there were 4,000 people I know of in Havana who were ready to move when that invasion came, if they knew when. The people who were to inform them were locked up in the Skyways Motel across from the airport here 2 days before the invasion and not allowed to communicate with anybody. Those were the things made us feel that somebody here was working on the other side. Because I think at that time here there was a lot of sympathy for Castro. They thought this was a government, or people who had been tyrannized by Batista, and here was a man going to bring in justice for everybody and taking care of the poor and all this sort of thing.
The Cuban Americans seem very bitter about Kennedy. How do you read his handling of the thing?
Well, I think he didn't do too badly, but he made one mistake as far as the Cubans were concerned, and that was in the deal he made with Khrushchev at the time of the year after or so, the Bay of Pigs, with this missile crisis we had, that he guaranteed Khrushchev we would not invade Cuba. The Cubans were very bitter about that because they felt we should have invaded. Obviously, every Cuban doesn't have the same opinion about anything the same any more than we do, but I had a friend there who was an elderly man. He's dead now. He was about 10 years old when Cuba became independent back in 1902. And so he watched. He was old enough to know what was going on, and, watched the government go all those years. And he lived through the Machado dictatorship and the Batista dictatorship, Castro's taken over and all of that. And he said, the United States made two mistakes. One was when we got into the Spanish-American War, we wanted to be very virtuous. We weren't interested in territory. So we stated immediately we would not annex Cuba. So when the war's over, we annexed Puerto Rico and the Philippine Islands. The president at the time, McKinley, said that he did not know or couldn't locate on a map within 1,500 miles where the Philippine Islands were. But he explained that one night as he was praying before he went to bed, it came to him that we should take over the Philippines and convert those people to Christianity, which I suppose meant the Catholics out there should become Methodists, I don't know. But that was that jingo era, when everybody was expanding. England, Germany, everybody. And we got caught in that. But having promised we won't annex Cuba, we then annexed Puerto Rico, which has been a headache ever since, and there was no reason at all that we haven't. The second, he said, was doing away with the Platt Amendment. The Platt Amendment was one that said that the Cubans would become independent in 1902. They had full sovereignty over their country. We would exercise none, except in case of external or internal attack. In other words, if, let's say, Russia declared war on Cuba, then we'd come to their defense. Or if there's a revolution and it gets dangerous to Key West or someplace, we'd go down and intervene there. We'd intervene. Now, we did intervene with that once in 1908. They were having a revolution after their second election. They elected a president, then the first election they had after that, there came a revolution. And so we did intervene and sent a man down to run the government until they could straighten things out. And that's a bad chapter in Cuban history, if you read it from Cuba's point of view. This great imperialistic giant up to the north sending people down to run our affair. So Roosevelt got rid of that Platt Amendment. I've always felt that's a good thing to get rid of. If the Cubans want to have revolutions, let them have it. Why should we worry about it? And I don't consider Cuba a threat not any more than I do Nicaragua to the United States. I can't imagine Nicaraguans invading Louisiana and moving up to Minnesota. So that I think we should help them because of our resources, greater wealth, this sort of thing. But let them alone. The only way they'll learn to govern themselves is governing themselves. And it takes a lot of time. They've had very little experience. I think it's interesting here that they're taking a very active interest in politics. Now elect this lady to Congress. They elected a Cuban mayor of Miami at some point.
They're very conservative as a result of their experience.
Experience over there, yeah.
What were they like over there? I mean, was there a spirit of liberalism at all in Cuba when you knew them there that you don't see?
Yes, there was. But again, I'd say it was, as it is here somewhat, sort of divided between journalists and intellectuals on one side and businessmen on the other side. When you have very little to lose, you can be very liberal. When you have a lot to lose, you suddenly become conservative because you get worried about it. And that division was there, and Cuba was becoming, our influence there was great, there's no question about it. Because their customs were becoming very Americanized, and a lot of their people had studied up here and lived up here and so forth. They had trade relations, business relations. So that the sad part of this Cuban thing, in my opinion, is that it wasn't necessary. They did need a change in government. They did need more honesty in government. But the country was getting better all the time. And if you just let it alone, eventually, I figured they'll get tired of electing all these people who are stealing from the treasury and put a couple honest people in to get this thing on track. The same as happens here. You get a corrupt city administration, after a while they'll throw it out and put somebody else in.
At the time of the Bay of Pigs invasion, what percentage of the Cuban people probably still supported Fidel Castro?
Up till that point, it was going down rapidly. Probably he has a minority by that time. This is just speculation. But I'd say when he came in, 90%.
But wasn't Kennedy's information from the CIA that there will be a great popular rebellion, and as soon as those troops hit the beaches of Cuba, that all the Cubans will rush to their assistance?
Except they locked up the people over here, could tell them when to do it.
So you think that was sort of sabotaged?
Yeah, what was sabotage? Now then, Cuba has a coastline, if you measure by calculus, because of all the little bays and inlets and all that thing, of about 2,500 miles. There's one stretch of swampland, and that's where they decided to send these young men in. A lot of them drowned, they just went sunk in the mud.
Shortly after that, we got heavily involved in Vietnam. Do you see any parallels? In other words, what if indeed that first landing had some success and they started lines, battle lines and the rest? Could it have led to a sort of a civil war in Cuba with perhaps 1 million people dying?
No, I don't think they would have had that many deaths. There would have been considerable deaths, but at that time the population was probably about 6 to 7 million, so 1 million deaths would have been 1/6 of the people. Usually you don't lose that many in a war. I don't know whether it would have been successful or not, because Castro still had a following, and he had an organized militia, which wasn't very well organized, but it was better organized than the people who were fighting them.
I'm going back when I asked you about your assessment of Kennedy's hand. You're not as hard on Kennedy as the Cubans are.
No, I think he made a mistake in what he said.
In promising never to invade.
Never to invade.
Do you think there was a time subsequently after that promise when he could have invaded?
No, not necessarily, but I don't think you make that kind of a promise. That ties your hands too much.
Well, you don't always have to honor your promises.
No, but you then ought to give a reason for not doing so.
Yeah.
I think it's much better in diplomatic relations, I'm not a diplomat, but to leave as many options open as you can and let the other fellow do some guessing too.
Yeah.
See, Khrushchev would have gotten those missiles out of there anyway. He was not ready for war with us. And so that it was not a necessary thing. He demanded that. Doesn't mean you have to give it to him. I think Kennedy could have said something like, we have no desire to invade Cuba. We don't intend to invade Cuba. And we won't unless there's a very serious provocation.
Anyway, you had to leave. You came here to Miami, and at what stage was this college in then? Were you offered this site here on the Palmetto at that time, or did you have a choice of places?
No, we were offered this, which we didn't know at the time. But this was still in controversy between the two dioceses, between Miami and St. Augustine. And so the bishop spoke to me one day about another piece of property without telling me why. I said, I think we'd be better off where we are. And he said, okay, we'll stick with that then. So that's why we're here.
Do you know what the other piece of property was?
No, it was down 27th Avenue somewhere, but I don't know just where.
So that was the only other thought of other property?
Yeah.
Some piece of land on 27th?
7th Avenue, yeah. So this was a better spot then than it is now. In other words, you see, Carroll City had just been developed and it was an all-white settlement. It was not, it didn't look like a bad place or an area that would go bad.
I heard one rumor that they were offered land around Mercy Hospital or something like that.
don't think so.
What about the name of the college? Was that already a given?
Yeah, the bishop wanted Biscayne College.
Where did he take that name from?
I suppose the whole town here, Biscayne Bay, Biscayne
Yeah.
Boulevard, Biscayne, this and that.
Yeah. Jimmy O'Malley was one of your first professors here.
Yes, he didn't want a religious name. He didn't want Sacred Heart or something.
Why is that?
Because he said he was always bothered by sport pages which said Sacred Heart Wallops Blessed Virgin Mary or something like that.
Yeah.
27 to nothing. And probably just a personal reaction he had, but he didn't want to be called some religious name. Yeah, Jim O'Malley came the first year. The first year he got out from Cuba, and that was the year he had a job at Miami Beach High School, so he taught there for a year. And then he came here his second year out, which was our third year.
We have a building named after him here now.
Yes, I know that. Yeah.
When he died, at his funeral, it was revealed that he had been a CIA agent.
Yeah.
And they showed an award he'd won and the rest of
yeah.
it. Were you aware of any activity like that when you were in Cuba?
No.
Were anything you do just to you or?
No. He was my assistant. He was the assistant regent of studies.
Yeah.
And no, I saw no sign of that.
I wonder in what way he might have been helpful to the CIA.
I suppose giving information. I suppose the CIA had people in the embassy. I didn't know about that, but I do know that the FBI had 3 people there, and I knew them quite well.
At the university? At the embassy?
At the embassy. They were called legal attachés. And I suppose the CIA worked through them or with them and getting information that would be useful to us. And the only thing I remember O'Malley did mention, or I probably mentioned to him, there was a CIA man there named Wilson, who also was a businessman. He owned 3 or 4 gas stations. And he was apprehended by the Cubans and accused of being a CIA agent and shot when Castro came in. And that upset O'Malley a lot. Then I didn't realize this when she said it to me, but when I got out, about the day after I got out, down at the Jesu Church in downtown Miami here, I ran into Mrs. O'Malley. And Jim was still in jail in Cuba at the time. And she said, I think I'm going to be a widow, Father. I'm never going to see my husband again. She thought he'd never get out. But he got out within about 4 weeks. The strange thing of the inefficiency of their systems is unbelievable. We had a professor there who was very anti-Castro, very open about it. In fact, was on television and sort of the equivalent of a news program or something here, and was attacking the principles of this new government and all that sort of thing. So one day the police arrive at his house, arrest him, his wife, and a colored girl who was working there. And they take him to one prison where they were putting men, and the other 2 to another prison where they were putting women. And the man was out in 6 days. His wife and the colored maid were in for 6 weeks. They never did anything. So you couldn't, it was not an efficient government. I'm sure it's not yet.
Here at Biscayne College, you were here, what, 4, 6?
I was here from 61 to 68.
And you and Father Sullivan were
Yeah,
the ones who were the first administrators.
then I taught here a year when I was pastor over in Dania for a year, and I taught here. That was 75 to 76.
Do you feel bad that the Augustinians no longer have the university and its stable?
Yes, to a point I do. I'm not sure we could have held it forever anyway because of our manpower problem. But the way we got out of it was not pleasant. And nor was it necessary. if things had been taken care of when they should have been taken care of. You see, they let go too long and there was a lot of bad management, and that's why now they're $19 million in debt or something. All of that could have been prevented.
You've been on a lot of boards of
Yeah.
trustees, including this one. What are board meetings like? Do they ever end up in shouting matches or any of the excitement?
Well, once in a while you get strong differences of opinion on something, normally not too much. An agenda is generally drawn up by the administration, as the president and some other people, or the executive committee of the board. Then it's to deal with policies. You don't deal with administration, but except as so far as you set policies, and then the administration is supposed to follow those policies. And your biggest responsibility is fiscal. You should be able on the board to come up with a balanced budget and make sure the administration keeps it balanced. And that's what was not done around here for a long time. So that each year they were going further in debt and further in debt and further in debt. And right now we're, I think, in a bad situation. Not an impossible one, but a bad one. It's going to take some years to dig your way out of.
You had a heart attack in 1980?
81.
What's a heart attack feel like? I mean, you always hear about people having heart attacks. And how bad is the pain?
I don't think I had any pain.
Really?
I don't recall any pain. I couldn't breathe. I was having great trouble breathing. I had some pain, chest pain, but not serious. And I did various things. I stood up and walked around. I laid on the bed, I sat in a chair. I did various things to try to see if I could do something position-wise to feel better. And after about 2 hours of that, I went to a priest who lived down in Carter and said, "You better drive me into Lawrence General Hospital." I was up in Merrimack at the time. And I spent 23 days in the hospital.
Do you think that a man of the cloth thinks about death any differently than a layman? I mean,
I think it depends more on your age than your state of life. The younger you are, the more remote it seems, and maybe the more you dread it. And the older you are, the closer it seems, and you kind of, well, that may be some relief. I don't think I fear death at all. If I'm going to die tomorrow, I die tomorrow. I'm not sure I felt that way 30 years ago.
your concept of heaven, I mean, has that evolved, or do you think about heaven much?
Yeah, I think it's a rather satisfying thought. Hopefully I'll get there. I'm not sure I'll get there, but if I get there, I'll be quite content.
When you look back over your life, was there one year or one period of your life which you might say was probably the happiest of your life?
It would be hard to pick out one. I've had several places that I enjoyed very much. I enjoyed our novitiate very much, which was a tough year, discipline-wise, but it was a pleasant year. We got on a big farm up on the Hudson River. And I found that to be a very pleasant year. I've heard other priests say they hated that year up there, but just the way different people react. I would say that was as good a year as I had. Another thing I enjoyed very much was doing graduate work at Catholic U. I found that stimulating, interesting, and I figured I was learning a lot, and I really enjoyed it. And I enjoyed the year in South America, because you see so many people in so many different situations, and it makes the history live a little better if you've been there and looked at it.
What would you think of as your greatest accomplishment? How would you like to be known?
Survivor. I don't know as I've had any great accomplishments. I just took jobs that were given to me and tried to do the best I could with them, like starting this place. Working in Cuba, being president at Villanova, working in Merrimack. I don't think I've done anything outstanding, but I sort of kept things going anyway.
Do you have Any regrets about anything? You could do things over again?
Not really. No, I don't. I think I don't look back at things and then worry about them because I figure there's nothing you can do about them. They're over. I think that's helped me to keep going. I tend to look forward rather than backward. And I suppose if I look back, I can see a lot of things could have been done better, but I didn't know that at the time, so I was doing the best I could.
You mentioned that priest who was an influence on you at the beginning of your life.
Yeah.
Who have been your heroes in your life?
Well, it depends on how you mean a hero. I don't know exactly what you mean by
Well, how
hero.
about in the public sector? People we would know, politicians or...
Like Richard Nixon or...
Yeah, like, that'll be an example.
Not many. I think the man who impressed me most, I saw him when he was a cardinal before I saw him as Pope, and that was Pius XII. He impressed me greatly. Another man who impressed me greatly was Cardinal Cook, the Archbishop of New York. That's probably a little prejudice on my part because of all the bishops I have ever met, he understood higher education problems better than anyone I ever met. And when I was, at 2.5 years I was in the Bronx, he had me going around to colleges in the New York Archdiocese as a sort of consultant and helping them out. And he was interested in doing this, and most bishops aren't.
Any political heroes?
Not many, they're hard to find.
What about the influence of the arts in your life? Like, for instance, literature. Is there a book that has influenced you, or a writer?
Well, I couldn't pick one out and say this writer or this book. I like to read. I've read a good deal in literature and enjoyed it more than anything. To say that one of them influenced my life or made me do things differently or anything like that, I can't think of anything like that. Hopefully the Bible and something of that nature. But
What would you list as hobbies, or what is your idea of a really enjoyable evening or afternoon?
well, I like athletic things. You know, I like to watch baseball. I used to be a baseball coach once. And so that in form of recreation, I would say probably athletic events more than anything else. I have no musical skill at all. I couldn't sing a scale if Pavarotti was leading me. So that I don't get much out of music. I haven't seen a movie, I guess, going to a movie in 10 years or thereabouts, because I lost interest in that. I think being with friends of mine, for example, I have a friend in Philadelphia, and he's a bachelor, and he and I usually have dinner together on Friday night after we both had a week's work, and go out and have a couple of drinks and a good dinner, and we both enjoy that about as much as anything.
What's your favorite drink?
Scotch. I drink Scotch. I have to defend the Suffolk culture.
How about things, possessions? Is there, wherever you live, is there something there, if there were a fire in your house, that you would first grab? Do you have
The only thing of value I have is in my room, or the rooms I have up there. We have two are books, and I probably couldn't grab too many of them. I wouldn't be able to carry them. But that would be the thing I would feel the most. Other clothing and so forth is replaceable.
Yeah. But there must be a lot of mementos after.
Yes, yeah, I have quite a few memento things, but they're probably important to me and not to anybody else.
You have a favorite time of the day?
Yeah, bedtime, man.
I'm afraid it could be. I thought you'd say dinner time or cocktail hour, because I think I've just about taken you through the cocktail hour into the dinner time
Yeah,
at
they eat
the
over there at
monastery.
6, yeah.
Any closing thoughts, Father, as we wind down?
No, unless you had something specific to ask.
What are your plans for the future?
I've been told by a physician not to live in the north in the winter, so I think I'll be living in Florida in the winter and in the north in the summer. And do pretty much what I'm doing now, except I'll be off the provincial council in January. But I'll be on the board here and on the board at Malvern Prep. And I do some financial work for a seminary our students studying in Washington. That'll be about it.
Thank you very much for being with us this afternoon.
Very glad to be with you, Dave.
Thank you.
Anytime.